So thank you very much. So a little introduction for myself. I am a learning experience design consultant. I've been helping people learn one way or another through my whole career. I did K-12 music and band teaching. I did corporate software training. I've worked in online universities, and these days I do a lot of workplace learning, but I also do a lot of coaching instruction designers and trainers on how to use scenario-based learning and storytelling. So let's start out with a definition, and this is about the most self-referential definition I could possibly have, which is what's scenario-based learning? It is learning through scenarios, right? That is the most basic level. It is deliberately, though, the broadest definition here with the most flexibility. The scenario might be central to the learning, or it might just provide support in one part of it. And terminology, scenarios versus stories, I am using them somewhat interchangeably. I think storytelling is the most broad part of it, and there's lots of storytelling that is not for learning. Scenario, I often find, especially when I'm doing workplace training and corporate, that the word scenario gets less resistance than story. That people think story is too fluffy. And so if you're thinking about this and thinking, storytelling seems kind of fluffy and I don't know how this is going to apply to real world stuff, then think just scenario instead of storytelling. So you might be wondering, reasonably so, what's so great about scenario-based learning? So we're going to start with some examples and see why we might want to use this approach. Look for some inspiration from other sources. So are any of you familiar with this lifesaver training? This is from the UK. This is interactive videos related to life-threatening situations where you have to do CPR or help someone. This is sort of like the high end, the Rolls Royce perhaps of of scenarios. These are scenarios where it is high-end videos. If you're looking at the screenshot and thinking, I kind of recognize her, that is Daisy Ridley pre-Star Wars. She is one of the actors in this. They're interactive videos. So it is, for example, in the one that Daisy Ridley's in, she is in a parking garage and she sees someone just before she arrives, we see someone have a cardiac event and fall to the ground. And she comes upon this person who is on the ground, non-responsive, and you walk her through. This is great in terms of it is intense, but it is something that does walk you through the process, and it is doable for a lot of different audiences. For example, this is one of the screens where you've watched a video and then the video pauses and this is a different scenario where you're seeing somebody who you're at a party and one of your friends has gone inside. You then see that he's on the ground and you have to quick decide, and there's a timer, so you've only got seconds to decide. Are you going to go run to your friend who's laying on the ground, or are you going to check for danger and then go run? And in this case, there's broken glass on the ground. So you're supposed to check for danger so you don't step on the broken glass and get yourself injured too. And these situations pause and you make decisions. And even though it's clearly video and it's clearly not real, what I find from a lot of people is that yes, indeed, your heart beats faster as you're trying to do this, especially because you're trying to do it fast. Yeah, and so then and that it prompts people to share their own experiences. It prompts people to share their own stories. So it gets this emotional response. This is a really well done training. It's very high-end media. It's very expensive. You are not going to replicate this project in your own things, but I think it's worth looking at the inspiration. I've got another one here that is a little bit less. This is something that I did for the National Audit Office this year. I did a series of videos with a story in segments that they used as part of a live training. Now, this is a snippet out of video 4. So this is 4 of 7. It's in the middle of a story. The overall story is following a team that is conducting an audit where several things go wrong during the project. So this is about 1 minute. And I want you to watch this. And as you are watching this, I want you to think about, even without you knowing the full context, what are some things that you think could be what we were training about, and what were the topics that they were expecting the learners to learn about in this.
Do we normally wait this long for sample evidence? I've only received something for about 1/3 of my samples.
It depends on how good the finance team is, but I haven't had much through either. And the bits I have had aren't great quality. I'm not sure I can sign off quite a few of them. Has Keith said anything to you about it, Rishi?
He's not mentioned any specific reason for a delay, but I haven't really had time to escalate it. Can you all take responsibility for your samples and chase up the evidence?
I guess I could send another email. I hate approaching people face to face. It can be so awkward. It was so much easier when we were all working remotely.
Hi Rishi, is everything okay on the sample front? I've had a look at the tracker and it doesn't look as progressed as I would expect for this stage in the audit.
That's my bad. I haven't had the team update the tracker in a couple of days, so it probably isn't as bad as it looks. I'll get them to update it by the end of the day.
So even without seeing the rest of that's even part of that's part of the scenario. So even without the rest of this, they were using this as part of a live event where they watched the videos and then in small groups reflected on it. What do you think from watching that without context? What could you guess might be some of the topics or the problems that they wanted people talking about in those small groups? Leadership and communication, time management, people management, personality differences, miscommunication through email, right? Because she talks about doing things through email rather than going to talk in person. Transparency, yes, because they talk about doing work offline versus sharing it. Managing challenging situations, accountability. So this was a 1 minute scenario, and you can see how this was 1 minute out of something, and altogether they had about 20 minutes in 7 videos, all that could prompt these discussions about how do you manage things. And sometimes we think, well, a story has a beginning, middle, and an end. This was clearly like right out of the middle of it and left unresolved. And that was okay because they were using the stories as a prompt for reflection in their discussions. So this is one called Chatterpast. This is so the animated video is, less, we're sort of going from the highest end, most expensive media to less expensive things. This is one called Chatterpast, where you are chatting with people from, as you can see sort of on the side, Iron Age in Roman Britannia. So it is a history teaching tool for students where they have these characters set up and you pretend that you are talking to somebody from the past. So if she says, "Oh, what's a garden?" I've started this one a little bit, and you can see that you make your choices and then it responds. Sometimes there is only one choice. There's little bits of information, but it is teaching this history but as if you're talking one-on-one with one other person. It's a bit of historical fiction. But through a chat and through an interactive rather than just passively reading that historical fiction. And as a tool for teaching history, I thought that this was a really interesting project. But ultimately, this is text. There are some images. It is interactive. And this one is a pretty extensive scenario. This was definitely a project that took a lot of time to build because there's all of these other characters that do things. But the tool that they use to build this is a free tool that I'm going to show you a little bit more later. So I know that this next one is more text than should really be on a slide for good slide design purposes, but I do want you to see an example of something that I did with one of my clients who was a university. This is a university where it's a graduate program for training counselors for substance use and alcohol use disorders. It was a life cycle psychology training. And so they had an assignment. And so over the course of this entire university course, each week, the students wrote a little bit of a story and the students created a story. So there's assignment instructions on the left and the sample student response on the right, where it was talking about how events from even before the main character was born affect their relationship with alcohol and substance use. And looking at this from a whole thing. And for training counselors, writing these stories was an exercise in increasing empathy. So this was a really extensive, this was a lot of work for the students to be creating these stories, but they did it over the course of a whole, over multiple weeks. But it ultimately was just text. There was text. There was no fancy multimedia. And so sometimes you can do it with just text. So yes, again, like I said, look at the Lifesaver one. It is a great training and it's good for inspiration to think about how to do things, but know that you can take inspiration from those things. And what you create for yourself might be just text or text with some static images, and that might be okay. So this is Bloom's taxonomy, right? The idea with Bloom's taxonomy is that you have sort of the lower level skills at the bottom of this pyramid, the remember and understand, and the higher level skills at the top, the apply, analyze, evaluate, create. Depending on when those of you who have been using it for years may have seen the original version where it was synthesis and evaluation at the top instead of create. Evaluation was at the top and synthesis was the second instead of create and evaluate. There's some different versions of this. Without thinking too much about the specifics of this, though, when we think about assessments in education, a lot of what we do is at the level of these two lower level things, right? It is, do you remember things? Do you understand? It is, we don't always assess application and analysis and evaluation creation. We do sometimes, it's not zero, but a lot of our assessments are down at this level. But if you are thinking about preparing students for the workforce, yes, they need this foundation of understanding, but when they're actually out working, they're going to be applying and analyzing and evaluating and creating more than simply remembering. So if we can get our class activities and our assessments up into these higher levels more, that's helpful. So let's imagine that you are creating a course for doctors about motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is a technique for having conversations with patients to encourage behavior change. So you could ask a question like this. I'm going to give you a second to read this question and then think about what level of Bloom's taxonomy does this question measure. And I will say this is one of the challenges of Bloom's taxonomy. It's a useful model, but there's a lot of just trying to get things into specific levels is tricky, and there's room for disagreement on this. So there is not necessarily a single right answer, but I do see that most people have said understand. So if you've introduced this concept already, this question probably aligns to your content. It probably aligns to your learning objective. It's very abstract. It is essentially a question that says, do you remember when I explained what open-ended questions were, what they're for? And so it is that sort of remembering and understanding. So now let's look at another question. And I'm going to give you a minute to read this one before we open up the next poll. So this question, this is another example question. And yes, we have a photo here and a background. We've set the context. But now we have a doctor who's working with a specific patient. And he's working on this brief intervention using motivational interviewing. And let's see what level of Bloom's taxonomy you think this one is. So this time, now we've kind of moved up the pyramid. The most popular answer is apply. The second most popular answer is evaluate. And I will say I could make an argument for either one of those. I personally would probably agree that it's apply, that it is you have a situation and you are applying what you've learned into a specific situation. That's probably where I'd put it. But the evaluating which is the best question to meet a goal, I agree. There's an argument there, even an analysis. So this one's probably a higher level. So this is concrete. The previous question was very abstract. This is concrete. And if we're trying to help people practice skills to prepare for the workplace, if we're trying to change behavior, we need to go a little further than just understanding. And in this example, the learners are making a decision about what to do in a specific situation. They are practicing their decision-making skills. It is still about open-ended questions, because the correct answer, the are you concerned and do you understand, those are both yes/no questions, and they're not open-ended. B here, what concerns do you have about your diabetes, is an open-ended question that opens up the conversation and lets the patient say what his own concerns are to guide that. It's part of the technique there, right? So if you know that it's open-ended questions, knowing that something's supposed to be open-ended questions and being able to identify what's the actual open-ended question out of a list, that's applying the skill. This, however, is not a big change. The question and the scenario itself is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 sentences. We've got 3 choices. This isn't a huge change. So that last example was a mini scenario. It's a 1-question mini scenario. What kind of technology do you really need to do a mini scenario? I know I started out with the really fancy ones like the Lifesaver and the chatbot and the animated videos. But a mini scenario, a couple of sentences plus a multiple choice question. Do you need fancy technology for that? Could you do it in a classroom and just have people raise their hands for which answer they think? Could you do it with pen and paper? Right? So mini scenarios are one of the things that you can do even if you don't have a lot of resources and don't have a lot of time. They're one of the easiest ways to get started using scenarios is by changing some of your assessment questions or your practice questions to do these sorts of mini scenarios. So why do we do scenarios? It is the real life decision making, right? Just like the last example that I showed where it was training doctors in healthcare education, putting them in a scenario, we can give them the opportunity to practice making real life decisions. It gives them a safe space to fail, that they can make mistakes and do it in these scenarios without it being dangerous for them to do so. Scenarios can trigger memories and lead to better retention. They can engage the emotions, and they can accelerate expertise. Accelerating expertise is, there's some research on how fast can you get someone to the level of competency. And so, for example, there was a study looking at automotive technicians. And when they did on-the-job training, it took 200 hours to get someone to the level of competence doing all of the troubleshooting that these automotive technicians needed. When they did instructor-led training, it was a lot faster. It was 100 hours. So it was half the time with instructor-led training. But when they did a scenario-based e-learning where they had simulations and people were really practicing the skills over and over and making the right kind of troubleshooting decisions, they got it between 33 and 66 hours. So we went from 200 hours to probably around 50 hours. So people can gain those skills faster when we're using scenarios. And specifically, although I know we've been talking about the Bloom's taxonomy, that we want to do more than just memory and understanding, but you do have to have memory and understanding as the foundation. That's why they're the bottom of the pyramid. So stories support memory. This is a meta-analysis that I just had discovered a couple of weeks ago, although it was published in 2021. They looked at over 75 samples, over 33,000 participants, looking at this meta-analysis on how people remember and understand with what they call narrative versus expository text. And the narratives were stories versus any sort of essay or informational text. And overall, across that, the quote here was, "We found that stories were more easily understood and better recalled than essays. Moreover, this result was robust, not influenced by the inclusion of a single effect size or single study, not moderated by various study characteristics." So this research here was that generally having some stories does help people understand. There are exceptions to this, and that's not to say that everything should exclusively be stories. But there is evidence that, we have used stories for learning as human beings since we all sat around campfires telling stories on how hunting mammoths worked, right? It is very much how our brains are designed, is to remember with stories. And there is some evidence that stories do have a privileged place in our memories, that we think about things in stories. It's also a question of motivation. And I often hear from educators that learner motivation is a real problem. Because it is well, when am I ever going to use this and how is this relevant? And learners are motivated when they can see the relevance of what they're learning. I do really agree with this quote from David Merrill. And in the context of this quote, David Merrill goes on to say, "If they learn new information in the context of real-world problems, if they are shown a demonstration of the skills they're expected to acquire, if they have the opportunity to apply these skills in the solution of additional real-world problems or the performance of additional real-world tasks, then they are much more likely to acquire, retain, and be able to use the required skills." So it is that if we put people in those scenarios, in those stories, in the problems, especially when we can have them practice, that yes, it helps them remember and understand, but it also helps them do more of the skills that we're preparing them to do. And I've shown you a big range of things. And I want to emphasize, come back to this topic of there should be a range of options. Scenario-based learning does not have to mean complex simulations and big branching scenarios and games. It does not have to be an all or nothing. And in fact, if you're just getting started, I think it makes sense often to start small, incorporate these small scenarios, the one question mini scenarios into your courses. And some of these things you may already be using. Some of these things work better in, classroom and virtual instructor-led training. Some of these may work better if you're doing them asynchronously, where it is that, or, the anonymized things. So provided examples. There's a good chance you're already doing this, right? You're probably already having sometimes the story of the example of the time somebody did something like this. Mini scenarios, those one question mini scenarios, like the multiple choice questions where we looked at that. That's often when I work with organizations who are new to scenario-based learning, that's often where we start, is those one question mini scenarios. Even if we don't do anything else more, that we change out some of the multiple choice quiz questions to be these scenario-based questions so we get a higher level assessment. Because even that is moving forward. You may already be doing case studies where you have a longer scenario and more analysis. Case studies can be great for getting students to think at a deeper level. Branching scenarios are, if you've ever done a choose your own adventure book, they are scenarios where you have a choice, you make a decision, and then the story continues. And what branch of the story you see next depends on what choice you made in the last decision. So if you choose the open-ended question, you get some more information from the patient. If you choose a closed question, you get a yes or no answer, and you don't get additional information. And then the conversation goes in a different path. These are often used for conversation simulations. The chatbot, the Chatterpast, that was a historical chat, that's one that is a branching scenario. There's also more complicated simulations, or in live training, that can be a role play where you give people some scripts and some information about their characters and they do some of these things, or student created stories. I saw a great idea from Dr. Luke Hobson, who's an instructional designer at MIT, where he's doing with some of his courses is he gives the start of a scenario or a story and he leaves it at a cliffhanger. And then the students, either independently or in small groups, write the rest of the story. So unlike the example where I'd had where the students were doing a significant amount of writing, but those were master students doing a higher level of writing, but doing a small amount, finishing the story and coming up with an ending of, well, what would happen next in this story? And how would this main character get out of this problem? How would they solve that problem? And having the students create the stories. Some of these are more passive, some of these are more active. Ruth Clark, in her book on scenario-based e-learning, calls the more passive options scenario-driven rather than scenario-based learning. So I said, I'm taking a very broad definition, and it's not going to be the definition that every source agrees with. But I think that taking a really broad view of this, so that even if you think, wow, okay, like I'm never going to take the time to build these really complex simulations, I just don't have the resources and the time, that's fine. I get it. But maybe you can do more mini scenarios, or maybe you can figure out some ways to do student created stories. It's not that you're going to do everything. So that I want to give you some options so that you can find maybe one or two things that will work in your classroom. So when do you use scenarios? And these questions especially apply to things where we're looking at the more complex ones, the branching scenarios, the simulations, anything with more complex media. But I think for any of these, you can do even the mini scenarios for things that are skills or problem solvings, where the outcomes are skills development or problem solving rather than something that's procedural, where you're going to do it exactly the same every time. A scenario is probably overkill for a lot of that. Is it difficult or unsafe to practice it in the real world? So then maybe we do use some scenarios to get that realistic practice. Prior knowledge. If your students have some prior relevant knowledge, that helps in decision making. There are ways to do scenarios to throw people into it right at the beginning, and sometimes there's an argument for doing that, right? You put people into a scenario so that they figure out that they don't actually know as much about this topic as they thought they did, and then you explain it and they're more motivated to pay attention because they now realize that they don't actually understand it as well. But for a lot of these, especially for assessing it, that doing some prior knowledge, that's often why I often use scenarios in combination with some more direct instruction, right? We might do some more direct instruction and then use a branching scenario as a practice, or use a couple of mini scenarios for practice, and then we do a bigger branching scenario to tie multiple skills together. But we're giving them some prior knowledge through that direct instruction. There are time and resources involved in creating these, and you have to think about what's the appropriate level of media for the time and resources that you have. And longevity, is this something that's going to change 6 months from now? If that's the case, you need to pick something that's going to be fast to develop and fast to update. If this is something that's going to be a longer term skill, then maybe it's worth investing some more time in something more complex. So with the branching scenarios in particular, I use a tool called Twine. And Twine is a free and open source tool. So even if you have no budget, it is there. There's a browser-based version of it. So I know that you have some restrictions on what you're allowed to install without IT permission, but you can use the browser-based version of this. And I want to show you how fast you can create one of these branching scenarios, one of these sort of choose your own adventures. This video does not have any audio. And so the fact that there's no audio, it does not mean that there's a problem. But I want you to see how fast you can create a new story here, right? So you create something new. And in Twine, these are called passages. It's essentially every little bit of text is a passage. The only thing I've sped up here is my typing because it's boring to watch me type. Everything else is the real speed that it would be. And I use these double square brackets to make new links. You can see now there are links to 3 new passages. And so I can repeat that. Again, typing is sped up a little bit. But now you can see there's 7 passages in this. And one of the great things about Twine is that it gives you an actual clickable prototype. There's no programming involved in this. It's just typing in text with a little bit of markup. And so that in that little 1-minute video, you get to see that I made a bunch of different choices. And if you remember from earlier, this ChatterPast, this is also built in Twine. That's what that software is. This is one that I built. And I built this in like 3.5 hours total. I actually built the original thing in about 2 hours, and then I went back and I did some more formatting. It's a little, I've increased the font size so that it's a little easier for you to read on the screen. So this is like a customer service, right? So you can build this chat, and this was something that was built in Trialog, in the Trialog story format for Twine, that is designed for doing these chats. And it's a great tool, and it's free. Couple of other resources that you may have. If you want to do some scenarios and you want to create some stories, you have character images available to you in PowerPoint. And I find that a lot of people don't realize that you've got these. You've got images. There are stock images if you have an Office 365 subscription. And in fact, the illustrated image here, the face, the hair, the outfit, these are things that you can piece together, and you can do a little bit of customization. So if you want to play around with this, you can use PowerPoint, which is a tool that you already have, and do some, static images plus text, and have a scenario that you share with your students. Very quickly, I'm going to talk a little bit about AI tools. If you are somebody who's thinking, this is really cool, but I don't think I can write scenarios, the text tools here, things like ChatGPT or Claude or Bard, are all good for brainstorming ideas for scenarios. Scribe is another tool that's for software training more. There's lots of tools for generating images. So again, if you're looking for images to bring a story to life a little bit, many of these tools have free options. I like using the AI tools to say, well, give me 5 ideas for a scenario related to conflict resolution, or related to contractor safety in the workplace. And then I'll look through those and then say, okay, well, flesh out, idea number 3, where you have these two, you have a new employee who wants to change everything and an old employee who doesn't want to change anything, and help flesh out that idea. Using it as a tool for brainstorming, to get a little bit of an idea, the tools are really useful for that. There's definitely other AI tools for both voices and video. The National Audit Office video, one of those voices in there is an AI voice. Most of them were real people, but Sophie, who's the character who was thinking about how much she wants to just email people and not talk to them, that's one of the AI voices. The voices are getting a lot better than they used to be. And again, many of these have free, low-cost things if you're looking to create something. There's also a lot of risks with AI. The tools, ChatGPT and other tools, hallucinate. They make things up. Anything you make with AI, you need to verify it. You are experts. Use your best judgment. Think of it as a very enthusiastic intern who really wants to make you happy and will do what you ask, even if it means making something up when they don't know what they're doing. That's how you should think of these AI tools. There are questions about security. Don't enter proprietary content. Check your university policy. Do not enter private student information into AI tools. There's also questions about copyright, and the legal issues of that are still, frankly, in flux right now. But there are ways to potentially help support you as you create these scenarios by coming up with other choices or coming up with ideas for scenarios, and I think they're worth experimenting with. If you're not looking at these tools yet, maybe set aside a little bit of time to try out some of these tools. So thinking about everything that I've shared, the whole range of everything, did this give you some ideas? Do you have some ideas on how you could use scenarios in your teaching to help prepare students for the workforce? I also have some information on my blog. I have a lot of posts about scenarios. So if you're looking at this and you're looking at some more ideas, and you are welcome to connect with me there. While a lot of the work on my blog is related to workplace training, I do have a specific blog post about doing scenario-based learning in higher ed, which you will recognize some of the content from this presentation. But I have a lot of resources on my blog that are freely available. So thank you very much for attending. I really appreciate it. It's always easier to do these with an active audience.